Welcome back to the class, and today we are going to discuss yet another important sociologist, George Herbert Mead, otherwise known as G.H. Mead, a person who is an extremely important figure in sociology, not only because of his the usual contributions about sociological theory and then arguments, but he is one among the very few sociologists, or one among the very few important sociologists who provided a completely different orientation to the sociological enterprise, both in terms of its theoretical engagement as well as the kind of a methodological orientation. So Mead is significantly different in his sociological analysis, in his understanding about what constitutes social, in his ambition, in his scope about the discipline. He is very, very different. So G.H. Mead is one of the very important sociologists who laid foundation for the development of sociology in a peculiar way, in a particular direction. And that strand of theorization is widely known as the interactionism. There are different sections which we will discuss maybe towards the end of the course, just to give you some broad overview. But that particular way of sociological analysis, which focuses on interaction, okay, is something quite different from the other theoretical perspectives that are known as functionalism or conflict theory, because these two broad theoretical orientations look at the macro picture, the larger structural aspects of a society, whereas interactionism looks at the micro processes, and with the very term indicates interactionism, it looks at the dynamics involved in human interaction. Okay, so it has a very strong belief that human beings are unlike other animals, okay, and they are able to create a sense of society through their interaction. And human beings are able to create society, human beings are able to change the society according to their according to the meanings that they attribute to that. And this is very different from a kind of a positivistic understanding of society, as we have seen in the case of Auguste Comte and even up to Emile Durkheim. I think I hope you remember and you followed the discussion when we had a brief discussion about positivism. Positivism understands that there is an outside reality out there, and the task of the sociologist is to go collect those information and analyze them, and maybe to do kind of experimentation and other analysis, and then come up with a kind of a conclusion. Whereas interactionists, they take a completely different path. They would argue that there is no social reality out there. A perception of reality is created through human interaction. Okay, so in that one, it is very closely connected with psychology. It is very closely connected with the social psychology. So these arguments about the roles about mind, roles about senses, roles about self, these are some of the very, very important concerns in interactions theory. And we will see that, for example, George Herbert Mead, his theory about mind, self and society, or C.H. Coulay's, his arguments about looking glass self theory, or Bloomer's argument about symbolic interactionism, or Garfinkel or Goffman. All these thinkers, from which we will just touch upon towards the end of the course, will give you a very clear picture about this particular distinct focus or distinct approach of sociology. Okay, an approach which looks at which can be described as this micro sociological perspective. They are not talking about the larger historical transformation. They are not talking about the larger structure of society. Rather, they are looking at the very specific, very micro level interaction between two people, interaction in a small group, how people construct meanings, and how other people understand the same meaning that we want them to understand through gestures and symbols and other things. How do we engage in different role games, and how a particular role is understood by the other person. For example, in a classroom setting, okay, how there are very clear expectations about how a student is supposed to behave, how a teacher is supposed to behave. So the moment we enter into a classroom, we all, both the teacher as well as the students, they are performing their roles. Okay, they are performing the roles by adhering to certain established protocols, and these protocols are in terms of your gestures, in terms of your appearance, in terms of the way you sit, the way you look up to the teacher, the way in which so-called decorum is supposed to be maintained in the class, a host of other things. So these scholars would argue that a classroom space is created through these carefully choreographed actions, and this is something quite different from the perspectives from in functional theory or in conflict perspective. So George Herbert Mead is one of the most important, maybe we can say one of the important founding fathers of interactionist perspective. So we will discuss Mead in detail, maybe 3 or 4 classes on Mead, because he is an extremely important figure as somebody who is responsible for the establishment of this interactionist school. So there is another interesting thing about Mead is that he is an American. He was born in South Hadley, Massachusetts in 1863, and he is not somebody from Europe. Okay, and so far that we were discussing about scholars only from the European continent, whereas maybe except Ibn Khaldun, whom he discussed in the very first class, all other scholars whom we have discussed so far all from the from Europe, from Italy, from Germany, and then France, and then England. Nobody else, I think. So now we are coming across a scholar from the US, an American scholar, George Herbert Mead. But interestingly, he also spent a lot of time in Germany, in Leipzig, which we will see. So in 1883, Mead graduated from Oberlin with a major in philosophy, and in autumn 1887, Mead enrolled at Harvard University, where his main interest was philosophy and psychology. So you know that he's not kind of trained in sociology. He got a degree, a BA degree in philosophy and psychology at Harvard University, and 1888 he left Harvard after receiving only a BA and moved to Leipzig, Germany to study with psychologist Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt is the father of psychology, you know that, a very, very important figure. So unlike say the other scholars whom we found so far, unlike Weber or Marx or Durkheim, who were in the realm of political economy, philosophy and political theory, here Mead spent a lot of his time among psychologists and philosophers. Okay, so that is why he is able to look at this society, or he is able to look at the interaction between society and individual through a completely different kind of a perspective. And he went back from Leipzig to the US and joined University of Chicago and taught there until his death on 1931. And he was an extremely important figure, and it seems quite a lot of his writings are the verbatim translations or transcripts of his lectures that he used to give at University of Chicago. He emerged as an extremely important figure, a person who could promise a very very worthwhile examination of sociological analysis from a very distinct form. So now let us try to understand the intellectual background of G.H. Mead. What were the kind of intellectual strands, or what were the philosophical and theoretical arguments that shaped G.H. Mead's thinking? And first and foremost, Mead was influenced by utilitarianism, and this we have discussed. What does utilitarianism mean? Especially all the important people in economics: Adam Smith, David Ricardo. Then in political theory, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. So what does utilitarianism say, and why that or how that Mead was influenced by utilitarianism? Utilitarians saw human action as being carried out by self-interested actors seeking to maximize their utility or benefit in free and openly competitive marketplace. Okay, so the larger questions: how do people act? What prompts people to act? What prompt people to act in particular manner? And utilitarians had very concrete answer for that. They argued that it is a self-interest. So the utilitarians looked at human beings as motivated solely by self-interest to achieve certain goals, and they understood it as this open competitive market, often tended to emphasize, indeed to overemphasize, the rationality of self-seeking actors. So they looked at human beings as selfish, as people with very clear ideas and motivations, and people use rationality to achieve their goals. That is why quite a lot of economists used this particular theory to explain economic behavior, because we know that usually economic behavior is seen as the most rational behavior, isn't it? You don't bring in other elements like your affection or your emotions and tradition and other thing in the economic activity, where it is seen as on the basis of very precise, specific, rational thinking. The utilitarian position partially inspired Mead's view on the human mind as a process of reflective thought in which alternatives are covertly designated, weighed and rehearsed. So while utilitarianism explained human behavior, what was interesting for Mead was the applicability of this theory to understand this entity called as mind. Okay, and you know that this theoretical arguments, philosophical as well as psychological arguments about what constitutes mind is very fascinating. Okay, we use this term mind very loosely in our conversation. We say that he lost his mind, and are you out of your mind? So what do we mean by this term mind? Is it, we know that it is not an entity that exists anywhere. Okay, so is it same thing as brain? Has it got a particular structure, or is it a kind of a process that happens, or what is the connection between the development of mind and that of society? These are all extremely important questions that have really fascinated the scholars from ancient times. And why utilitarianism became an interesting theoretical platform for Mead, because it provided him with the opportunity to look at the mind as capable of reflection through alternatives. Okay, so we have the ability to assess or evaluate different options in front of us, isn't it? For any we take thousands of hundreds of decisions in our everyday life, not maybe very major decisions, but every decision. What kind of dress we are supposed to wear, what do we cook today, or which hotel do we go for food today, or whom do we invite for a party at home. Starting from this kind of very mundane everyday examples, our mind actively takes hundreds of thousands of decisions every day. And Mead argued that this ability to use, the ability of the mind to weigh in different options, to evaluate different options, and then finally reach the most suitable one. Okay, and whether the most suitable one is it the most rational one is a different question. We know that human being, we don't really go by all the typical rational explanation. Even if something is appears rationally correct, we might not opt for that, because there could be more important emotional or cultural reasons for certain things. But for Mead, this was something very important. He understood mind as capable of looking at various options, evaluating their pros and cons, and then take something and then choose something as the final option. And then second important strand of influence or strand of theory, intellectual engagement that influenced Mead was Darwinism. We have discussed it when we discussed Herbert Spencer. Mead used the theory of evolution as a broad metaphor to understand for understanding the process by which the unique capacities of humans emerge. Okay, this theory of evolution was something so influential for every scholars of that particular time, and more so in the case with G.H. Mead. Mead believed all animals, including humans, must seek to adapt and adjust to an environment. Okay, because evolution, we understand, is not only things that happen in your body, in your physical body, because of some mutations in the genes, but it is also heavily influenced by our adaptation with the changing environment. Okay, and that's a scientific theory which has been proven, that organisms, both animals and plants and human beings, we adapt, our body transforms by trying to constantly adapt with the kind of a environment. Hence, many of the attributes that organisms reveal are the products of efforts to adapt a particular environment. Mead borrowed from Darwinian theory the metaphor of adaptation or adjustment as the key force shaping, sorry, there is a gap here, shaping the nature of humans. So he understood human beings as extremely capable of evolving depending upon the situation. It's not that human beings are, are produced in a particular way. They are always designed and then crafted according to certain laws, and which they don't change. Okay, so interactionism has a very fluid understanding of society, unlike many of the philosophers, for example, like Simmel or Comte, who wanted to create social laws which are timeless. Okay, interactions do not believe in any of such kind of stuff. So they understood human beings as capable of evolving, capable of adapting with the environment and then changing their situation. The third important intellectual orientation was pragmatism. Pragmatism was primarily concerned with the process of thinking and how it influences the action of individuals and vice versa. Pragmatists became concerned with symbols, language and rational thinking, as well as with the way humans' mental capacities influence actions of the world. Mead accepted the metaphor that thought and action involve efforts to adjust and adapt to the environment. He embraced the notion of such adaptation is a continuous process of experimental verification of thought and action. So he he accepts these arguments of pragmatists, who argued that human beings use their faculties, use their rationality, use their culture, use various kinds of resources at their disposal for adapting themselves with the society. Okay, so this provides you with a picture of human beings are being extremely creative. Okay, human beings are being extremely imaginative, creative in terms of adjusting with the society and then moving behind. So you know that these observations offer very important insights about the capabilities of human beings as a particular species. Okay, a particular species endowed with a high amount of intelligence and endowed with this ability to interact with others and develop highly sophisticated mind and a highly sophisticated sense of collectivity, and that sense of collectivity enabled them to adapt with very challenging circumstances and then evolve successfully. And the third one, the fourth one, I think this number will be wrong. The fourth point is behaviorism, especially experiments of Russian psychologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. That this as well really influenced behaviorism. So what does behaviorism? Behaviorism is basically used by this psychologist to explain why we also behave just like animals on the basis of stimulus and response. You have learned a lot, you have heard a lot of stories about how we train animals, especially dogs. They have done a lot of experiments. For example, when you at the time of feeding a dog, you make a particular sound, and so that the dog gets to listen to the sound whenever he is fed. And after some time, even without the food, when he listens to that sound, the dog immediately thinks about the food and then begins to salivate. So these experiments try to understand how human thinking is linked with certain kind of stimulus. Okay, so how different animals or different species respond to the stimulus and then produce different kind of response, a kind of a stimulus response paradigm. And but the problem with behaviorism is that it tends to be very restrictive. It does not give so much of possibility, so much of space for the animals or the individual to behave differently. It's a cause and effect kind of a relationship. So Mead rejected extreme behaviorism but accepted its general principle. Behaviors are learned as a result of gratification as associated with them. Gratifications associated with them. This is an extremely important lesson. While Mead disagreed with extreme form of because if you think that human beings are just like animals who behave to a given stimulus, then it really fails to explain why there is so much of diversity in the way in which people react to certain stimulus. Okay, if we are afraid, then the way in which we behave are very different, or to a situation of threat, or to love, or to certain sexual stimulus. So people behave very differently to different situations. So, but for Mead, what was important was that behaviors are learned as a result of gratification associated with them. So the possibility of gratification, the possibility of satisfying your needs is an extremely important factor which influence your behavior. Most important, some of the most distinctive behaviors of humans are covert, involving thinking, reflection, and self-awareness. Okay, so unlike animals who don't really think too much before acting, many of our behaviors are covert, they are hidden, they are not expressed openly. We know that in our everyday life, isn't it? The kind of thinking that come through our mind when we sit in front of somebody, and sometimes we conceal that we never open up. Many times we put up an artificial face. Many times we openly, blatantly lie in front of the people. So even when we state something to the people, we might be thinking of the exactly opposite thing. So we are able to think covertly, involve thinking, reflection, and self-awareness. Mead postulated what some have called as a social behaviorism. From this perspective, both covert and overt behaviors are to be understood through their capacity to produce adjustment to society. Because see, for a typical animal behaviorist like Petrovich Pavlov, they conducted experiments on the animals, and then they observed the way in which animal behave. And because you can't communicate with the animal, you can't really think what is going through this animal's mind. Whereas Mead wanted to create a kind of a social behaviorism which involves both the covert thinking as well as the overt actions, because we generally do that. We think, and then on the basis of this thinking we act overtly. Then the most important influence was from Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, who really who was under whose influence Mead spent time at University of Leipzig. His views on gestures. So how gestures are important, how gestures represent a kind of a symbolic meaning, and how this is understood, why gestures have the ability to communicate to a large section of people, and those arguments were extremely influential. And then William James and pragmatism, the mind as a process and not as an entity. It's something very, very important. Whether mind is an entity, is it a structure, okay, or is it a process? It is something very, very, very important question. Is mind a structure, or is it a process, or is it both? What do you think? Is mind a process, or is mind a structure, or is it a combination of both? Now, the only thing which psychology has a right to postulate at the outset is the fact of thinking itself, and that must be taken up and then analyzed. So what is this process of thinking? Okay, so when you say that the thinking is a psychological process, it's an activity that happens within your brain. What does it mean? Okay, what does it mean? What are the kind of various other factors involved in it? What do we mean by when we say that it's thinking, and how do mind think by interacting with ideas from the outside world? Yet another important influence on G.H. Mead is Charles Horton Cooley, yet another American sociologist as well as psychologist, whose key ideas include a number of very, very important arguments, and especially his argument about this looking glass self theory has been extremely important. So, Coulé's arguments include: one, society is constructed from reciprocal interaction. Okay, society is not an entity out there, but it is constructed through reciprocal interaction. And here you will see some kind of a resonance with Durkheimian argument about society, when people come together, when they interact, and that interaction itself goes to a next level, goes to a much higher level, and it is constructed through reciprocal interaction. And interaction occurs through the exchange of gestures. So now, what does interaction mean? That is the focal point of these scholars who belong to this interactionist school. You know that almost every scholar, including Tonis and Weber and Durkheim, argued that society is made possible through interaction. But these people, they focus on the question: what is the meaning of interaction? How is interaction made possible? Okay, or what transpires when we say that people interact with each other, and what are the different forms of interaction? Okay, especially when human beings have the language, a highly developed, sophisticated medium of communication at their disposal. Okay, what is the role played by verbal communication? What is the role played by written communication? And more importantly, what is the role played by gestures, hand gestures, face gestures, and more broadly or more theoretically, what is the role of the symbols? Okay, because each of these things, whether it is a written communication or oral or gestures, these are all symbols. Okay, symbol, you know that it stands for something else. Okay, a symbol stands for something else. It only conveys a particular meaning. A traffic signal, a red light only emits a light in red color, but it conveys a meaning. It conveys, at least in a modern society, it conveys a universal meaning of danger or stop. Whereas this particular red light does not, will not convey any meaning to people who are not exposed to this modern world. It doesn't convey anything to a isolated tribe people. They only look at it as something very, very interesting, a different color which they may not have seen. Okay, so the whole question of a particular symbol having a particular meaning, and the fact that it is understood evenly, it is understood equally by everybody. Okay, including the person who intended as well as the person who is supposed to be the recipient. These are extremely important points. And so interaction occurs through the exchange of gestures, and self is created from and allows the maintenance of patterned social organization. So this is an extremely important point. What constitutes self? Okay, what constitutes self? What is the meaning of a self? And Mead has very fascinating analysis which we will discuss. He makes a distinction between I and me. Very, very fascinating discussion. But when we say that I don't want something, you say that you are talking about you as a person, isn't it? There is a very concrete, a crystallized idea of you as a particular person. And how did this particular entity come into being? How was that shaped? How was that constructed? What is the process involved in it? And we know that a child does not have a sense of self. A small child, a toddler doesn't have a sense of self. And it actually grows. As a person grows, this sense of self gets formulated. And that is an extremely interesting process that these people were interested in. So self is created from and allow the maintenance of patterns of social organization. And fourth point, social organization is possible by virtue of people's attachment to groups that link them to the larger institutions of society. Okay, so social organization is possible by virtue of people's attachment to groups that link them to the larger institutions of society. So the connection between an individual, his immediate groups, and with that of the larger institutions of society, and how that helps, that shapes the mind, that shapes the concept of self. These are extremely important arguments put forward by C.H. Cooley. And these arguments definitely shaped Mead's thinking as well. And one of the very interesting theory about of C.H. Cooley is looking glass self theory, which argues that you without other you simply have no concept of yourself. Okay, without other you simply have no concept of yourself. Is it very difficult to understand? Because we think whenever we think about we believe that we are only looking inward. Okay, but Cooley will not agree with that. Just like you, when you stand in front of a mirror, okay, and by looking at the mirror, you get an impression about how you look, how handsome you are, okay, or how smart you are. Cooley argues that the similar thing happens in your formulation of the self, but here instead of the mirror or instead of the glass, it is the others. Okay, the others reflect you. You look at the others in order to create a impression about yourself. Looking glass self theory. Okay, so you gauge others interpretation, others action towards you, and then on the basis of others action, others response, others attitude towards you, you create a kind of an image about that. Looking glass self theory, very very interesting argument, and I'm not going into the details, but those who are interested, you can look into that. It's a very very fascinating theoretical argument. John Dewey and arguments about pragmatism. Pragmatism is guided by the metaphor of the creative solution of problems by an experimenting intelligence, rather than the idea that people's conduct and beliefs are determined by static, objective criteria such as their class position or the collective conscience. And here you will come to know the kind of a difference between arguments of C.H. Mead and that of a person like Emil Durkheim. Okay, so pragmatism is guided by the metaphor of the creative solution of problems by an experimenting intelligence. Okay, this interactionism has enormous faith on the creativity and potential of people. It thinks that human beings have the unique ability to find solutions somehow. They are very creative. Okay, they are very creative. They are very very capable of overcoming hurdles. They are not the puppets who act on the basis of certain larger social structures. Whereas Durkheim would argue that human beings have very little freedom or agency onto themselves. They are entities who simply act as the base of social facts. That's I hope you remember. That's what when he talks about collective conscience, when he talks about social facts as having coercive impact on people. But here pragmatism would argue that rather than the idea that people's conduct and beliefs are determined by static objective criteria such as their class position or the collective conscience, they are able to move differently. They are able to actively construct and create their own life. So humans are unique by virtue of their behavioral capacities for mind and self. Conversely, mind and self emerge from the gestural interaction in society. Once they emerge, however, mind and self make a distinctive form of gestural interaction and an entirely revolutionary creation, symbolically regulated patterns of social organization. So on the basis of all these influences, now we are coming to the core of Mead's argument. Mead proposes that humans are unique by virtue of their behavioral capacities of mind and self. Conversely, mind and self emerge from the gestural interaction in society. Okay, so unlike a typical sociologist, Mead wants to argue that mind and self are the products of social interaction. So by using all these arguments or being influenced by all these intellectual traditions or intellectual arguments, Mead formulates his own arguments about the relation between mind, self and society. So he argues, or he postulates that humans are unique by virtue of their behavioral capacities of mind and self. Conversely, mind and self emerge from gestural interaction in society. Okay, so this is his very important argument. It's not that you have a mind and then on the base of this mind you get into this gestural action. Okay, it's not that from the understanding that you begin to act in certain ways. It's the other way around. Once they emerge, however, mind and self make a distinctive form of gestural interaction and an entirely revolutionary creation. Okay, so this mind and self is the one which actually it leads to symbolically regulated patterns of social organization. So it's a very interesting argument that from the mind and the self, it leads to a kind of a patterned forms of symbolically regulated patterns of social organization or otherwise society. Okay, so Mead has very important connection between mind, self and society, and that's what we are going to discuss in the coming classes. Okay, thank you.